Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our Toolbox Tuesday training. My name is Natalie Arriaga, and I'm a Civic Spark Fellow here at SCAG. And today I'll be facilitating the session. Edward Venegas is joining us today to help with any and all AV-related needs. At this time, we'd like to encourage you to type your name, organization, and pronouns in the chat feature. This will help us know who's in the room, and it will help us ensure that this feature is functioning for you. Thank you. Next slide, please, Edward. Now on this slide before you, you'll see a handful of housekeeping items. This workshop is anticipated to run for an hour and a half. Right now, all participant lines should be muted. At any time, if you have a question during the workshop, please type it into the chat box. We encourage you to ask questions. At the end of the presentation, there will be dedicated time for questions. We will try to get as many as we can during the Q&A opportunity. We will also have time at the end of today's presentation for any questions where you can also raise your hand and we'll call on you to unmute yourself. The material from today will be emailed to those who registered to participate in today's meeting. Next slide, please, Edward. So our first presenter today is Lucy Andrews, who is a PhD candidate in environmental science, policy, and management at UC Berkeley. She specializes in water management and climate change, with a particular focus on California's rivers and aquatic ecosystems. Lucy also works on CalAdapt and has recently supported the development of new climate data tools and educational material to make climate science widely accessible for adaptation practitioners. Today, Lucy will be presenting on a tool that CalAdapt recently developed called the Local Climate Change Snapshot tool. So Lucy, if you want to go ahead and share your slides.
Absolutely. Let's kick that into gear. Good morning, everybody. I'm dialing in here from Oakland, but have a particular appreciation for your part of the state. Prior to graduate school, I spent 5 years working with the Municipal Water District of Orange County on efficiency programming. And so it's fun for me, even digitally, to revisit that part of California. As Natalie mentioned, my name is Lucy Andrews, and perhaps I've met some of you in various venues, but for those who don't know me, I am on staff at CalAdapt. And CalAdapt is a website that is sponsored by a couple of California state agencies, the Energy Commission and the Strategic Growth Council, to provide the central repository for California's climate change projections. The hope is that by furnishing climate change projections to adaptation practitioners across California, our local and state plans for climate change can be really rooted in the best that our science has to offer. CalAdapt allows you to visualize climate data through a variety of what we call GUIs, or graphical user interfaces. It allows you to download climate change projections, both as spatial files and CSVs, depending on your preferences and your applications. And then more holistically provides some educational material for climate change science. We're continuing in particular to develop that educational material, so I'll provide my contact information toward the end. Know that we're excited to be useful and in whatever way possible. So feel free to be in touch if there's something you'd like to see that either you're having trouble finding or that perhaps doesn't yet exist. So I would actually like to know a little bit from you first, at least via the chat feature, what climate change impact you are most concerned about in the area in which you work. So take a moment and drop that in chat so that I've got a sense of where this audience is. What climate change impact are you most concerned about? And I'll read the selection as they come through. So we're seeing many folks commenting on extreme heat. I think that's top of mind for many people, given the world recently. Seeing concerns about species extinction and wildfire, drought certainly, subsidence for groundwater levels, sea level rise, urban heat island, so many of these various impacts. Some of them I will call physical impacts, meaning what we're seeing is changes in the climate system specifically. that impact things like temperature and precipitation patterns. There are also social impacts or compounding impacts where the physical change interacts with something in the built or the social environment to produce the risk that many folks are concerned about. For example, lack of water access. That has to do both with what's happening in our physical sphere, as well as the technologies of governance and management that folks may be working with. CalAdapt right now sticks pretty specifically in the physical environment, namely provides information about temperature projections, precipitation projections, wildfire projections, and sea level rise projections. That's sort of the core of the services. A lot of the impacts that have to do with the built environment, with economic systems, with population exposure, will require you to bring in some of your own information. And toward the end, if you're curious about ways in which folks have supplemented the data on CalAdapt with some of this more holistic insight, we can go there and I can at least point you in the right direction. I'd also love 1 or 2 brave volunteers to unmute and tell me a little bit about how you use climate data in your work, or if that's not something that you're currently engaged with, how you might want to, what it was that brought you here. Would anybody be so brave as to unmute and tell me a little story?
Hi, I'm Marcus Spiegelberg. I work for a company called ICF, and I'm working on a conservation plan in San Diego, and we're using it to project impacts and help us protect lands in the conservation plan area.
Awesome. Thank you, Marcus. You make my job a lot easier that I realize there are people on the other end of the phone and not just little Zoom boxes. Could I have one other person talk about, in brief, a couple sentences, your what we'll call use case for climate change data?
This is Paul Mclaren. I'm an associate planner in the city of Camarillo, and we are considering doing a climate adaptation and resiliency plan. I'm just trying to educate myself so that I can manage the project and make sure that consultants are using the most up-to-date data and data that we need in order to be able to make appropriate projections. Fantastic.
Thank you. I'm appreciative of all of you for your work. This is certainly meaningful work for the future of California, its ecosystems, its people, its ambitions for equity and economic development. Tip of my hat to you. You mentioned having folks working with the latest data, much of which lives on CalAdapt and has come out of the state's periodic climate change assessment process. The state of California, through a suite of its agencies and contracts with the scientific community, periodically produces climate change assessments that discuss the latest science and how it is anticipated and how climate change is anticipated to impact California's natural and social and economic systems. The data on CalAdapt is currently from the 4th assessment, which was released, I want to say, a couple years ago. And currently the state is anticipating and planning the 5th assessment. When data from the California's climate change 5th assessment comes out, that too will end up on CalAdapt. So when you're talking about the latest data, that is sort of the data sets that the state has endorsed for current planning. So I'm going to real quick pull up the CalAdapt homepage so that we can orient ourselves. And then I'll dive more specifically into the Local Climate Change Snapshot tool that Natalie mentioned. Both what it is meant to do, some of the terminology and the climate literacy that will be helpful, and also the mechanics of the tool itself. So here is the homepage for CalAdapt. The URL is cal-adapt.org. And right off the bat, you'll see this list of tools at the front. These are various pages that will allow you to select climate change data by location, by impact, by time period, and then see it in both graphs and charts, and then finally download it. We're in the process of updating some of this interface. So if you log on to CalAdapt in 3-4 months, you may see a different landing page, but the general structure of the website, that we have these core tools, some information about the download process, and then educational materials will persist. let's see, what else is here? We have options to find resources that will allow you to connect with the state's research catalog, particularly these fourth assessment products that I talked about. That will allow you to download data. For those who are inclined, we have an API, an application programming interface, a RESTful API that will allow you to pull the data to your local computer programmatically with computer code. We have a newsletter, comes out maybe every 6 months, and then some information about where the data itself has come from. We also have a help page that we're building out right now. So this will become much more robust, but there are some suggestions for using climate projections, frequently asked questions, and then ultimately a contact us button. We do our very best to be very responsive to folks who are ending up in our inboxes. So don't at all hesitate to reach out. We're a small but mighty team. So getting back to what is the meat of this presentation today. I'm going to be talking about the Local Climate Change Snapshot tool, which is a relatively new addition to the CalAdapt tools family and was developed in the past year to support folks like you who are doing municipal or regional planning for climate change impacts. Historically, the data and the tools on CalAdapt have existed to serve the energy community, but of course, climate change is not anticipated to impact only energy systems. We have this much broader landscape to consider. And so we've spent the past, I would say, 18 months interviewing folks across the state about what they might like to see in terms of climate change data for municipal planning. And this is where we've landed. So the tool is designed to be a little bit more introductory and accessible than many of the other tools that live on CalAdapt. So it's an entry point. And if you want to dig deeper, there will be other tools that allow you to do that. And the primary intent here is to support municipal adaptation planning. For example, local hazard mitigation planning or general plan compilation, as well as education and advocacy for nonprofits, for grassroots or community organizations advocating for specific funding programs, that sort of thing. And the Local Climate Change Snapshot tool accomplishes these things by simplifying settings for certain parameters, like the climate models that you'll use to produce the data and the types of time intervals that you may specify for your planning purposes. So we'll dive into that here together. To use the tool, you first select an aggregation boundary and a location. And when I say aggregation boundary, what I mean is the shape or the vector or the polygon over which you want to see data. For many of you, this may be the city or the county or otherwise the regional entity for which you work. This might be the city of Santa Monica. That would be an aggregation boundary. The county of Los Angeles, that would be another aggregation boundary. There are many that are pre-built into the tool, and we'll take a look at that shortly. You then are delivered climate change projections for a collection of physical variables, things like extreme heat days, warm nights, maximum one-day precipitation. You can take a look at what is anticipated for the location you selected. And then there's connection to additional resources. Some of them are educational, meant to help you understand the data. Others are about how the data has been put into use in various contexts. Predominantly housed in California's Adaptation Clearinghouse, which we can also discuss if you are unfamiliar with it. So the first page of the Climate Change Snapshot tool looks like this. There's an inlay map and there's a search bar to find a location. So you will enter an address or a zip code or otherwise select a boundary using these little toggle buttons. So you can identify a county, you can identify a city, you can even zoom into the census tract level if you know the code for the census tract you're most interested in. And you can look at a watershed. For those who work in the watershed world, we've pre-built data for the Huck 10 scale of watershed basin. Then here are a few other options. If you're looking at a county, this is what it will look like. You can either type it in and confirm it, or you can click on the map. Here's an example of it for a city where we have the boundary of the city of Stockton showing up there when I search for Stockton, California. Then we're delivered to the data page, and I will pull this up in the browser in a second, but I think an orientation with slides is helpful too. For temperature, you can look at temperature with a variety of indicators or indices. We have annual average maximum temperature, which certainly is a mouthful. And that means the average of the maximum daily temperatures for the year. So if you were to take the highest temperature of every single day in the year and then average those, that would be this value. Can do the same thing for the minimum temperature. Take the minimum temperature of 365 days in the year and then average that. We have extreme heat days, which I remember all y'all type it into chat was of particular concern. So this is the count of days in the year where the heat surpasses a specific locally relevant threshold for extremeness. We can look at what that means. And then warm nights, this concern that during periods of intense heat, if folks are unable to cool their dwellings overnight, the public health impacts of extreme heat will be compounded even more. On the precipitation front, we have ways of looking at both a lot of precipitation and not very much at all. So there's maximum one-day precipitation, the amount of rainfall that occurs in a 24-hour period. That may be useful to you if you think about flooding concerns or stormwater management, those sorts of things. The maximum length of a dry spell, so how many days in a row do we not see any precipitation? That may be concerning to you if you're thinking about water supply reliability or wildfire risk, for example, ecosystems as well. And then annual precipitation, how much the precipitation is supposed to be per year. On the wildfire side, we have the annual average area burned. And the wildfire data is a little bit more complex simply because the modeling has to consider both what's happening in our climate systems, but then also what's happening with our vegetation and our population, for example, encroaching into the wildland urban interface. I will put the caveat out that wildfire modeling performed for the fourth assessment, so therefore the data that lives on CalAdapt, did not happen for many urban areas, simply because the dynamics are unique and quite hard to model. So if you are looking at your service territory and you see that there's no wildfire data, that would be why. We anticipate remedying that for the fifth assessment and having a broader coverage of this data set, but right now it is predominantly focused on sort of WUI, wildland urban interface areas, and then more rural areas, managed forests, those sorts of things. So that's the data that lives in the Local Climate Change Snapshot tool. But what I want to do now that you have a sense of what's there is describe where it comes from. I think a lot of folks find that the data is easier to use when they have an appreciation for the process that produced it. And I'm going to start with the basics. What is a climate model? Many of you, I think, probably have some suspicion for this, but the way that we talk about what a climate model is actually will impact your understanding of what is on CalAdapt. And so put quite simply, a climate model is a mathematical representation of physical process, where climate scientists have essentially equations that discuss and represent the way that our climate system works, thinking about things like cloud cover and how heat moves through our atmosphere and how heat is trapped by and then radiates off of Earth's surface. All of these things are represented by these equations. The equations themselves are run over the surface of the Earth, with the surface of the Earth divided into a grid. And each cell in that grid has essentially one version of the equations run for it. And so you could imagine that you can only zoom in as far as that grid cell size. The smaller the grid, meaning the more finely resolved those equations are, the more specific the data may be, but also the more computationally intensive, meaning it takes forever to run these things. The larger the grid, the less resolution you may have. You may have only one value for, let's say roughly the entire state of California, but you can run it quickly and you can test different hypotheses by being able to run it often. So there's this trade-off between computational intensity and the resolution, or how finely scaled the data is. Climate scientists will run these models for the past to reconstruct the historical record as a way to test the veracity or the utility or the usefulness of these models. And then once they've determined that they capture climate dynamics well enough they will run them forward to create projections. So that's a little bit about what a climate model is. The data on CalAdapt has a grid cell size of 6 kilometers by 6 kilometers. So that's roughly 3 and a bit miles by 3 and a bit miles. You can't zoom in any finer than that. So I can't determine what is the projection for my house different from my neighbors because we're in the same grid cell. Just important to know. There are many different versions of these models that represent many different ways of illustrating or operationalizing climate dynamics. The model names themselves are a little bit impenetrable. They're often acronyms that reference the research facility that maintains them. So at the top of this slide, you'll see a whole list of these models. There are 32 climate models that are in common usage. The state of California has identified a set of 10 that represent our climate system particularly well, and then identified a subset of 4 that, if you're going to start somewhere, are a good place to start because they represent things in balance well. So know that there is a priority list of 4. Many of our tools allow you to work with that. There's a bigger priority group of 10, and then there's the full 32. It's often useful to use many models, and CalAdapt will help you to do that in a way that isn't overwhelming. That provides pictures of the average of many models, as well as some of the minimums and maximums that the ensemble or the collections of models will produce. In this figure, every model here is represented by one colored squiggly line. And then the full range of all 32 models is that shaded gray area in the back. So you can see the general trend, you can see the minimums and the maximums, and you can toggle models on and off. For your purposes, I anticipate that you'll be using model averages and then minimums and maximums, and won't need to drill into the details of any individual model. But just so you know what that is, that's how that information shows up on CalAdapt. So the first principle that I will encourage you to work with is to use individual models and model ensembles together, where any individual model may provide you with a minimum or a maximum, and then the whole models suite together will provide the average value that you may want to work with. So you can understand the average projection for temperature change, as well as the outer bounds of the minimum projection and the maximum projection. So if we see how that shows up in the Local Climate Change Snapshot tool, I'll pull it up now. So to do that, I will go to the Tools page and then select Local Climate Change Snapshot and identify an area that I want to work with. So for the sake of a place that just comes to mind arbitrarily, let's go with Manhattan Beach. I hit enter. I will search for it, confirm that I've ended up in the right spot. Yeah, all right, that looks pretty good to me. And I will generate a snapshot. In doing so, I'm then popped over to the data page. On the data page, I can see that I am looking at temperature information first. That's highlighted here in the teal. And that the indicator I'm looking at that describes anticipated change in temperature is annual average maximum temperature. Let's look at extreme heat days, because I know that that was concerning to many of you. So we can pull that up. And this tells me here that extreme heat days is the number of days in a year when the daily maximum temperature is above a threshold of 90.2 degrees Fahrenheit. For some of you, those who maybe work in more coastal locations, that may sound hot. If we have anybody here who does a lot of work in Riverside County, that may seem warm, but not super extreme for you. This temperature threshold for extreme heat varies by location. It is a reference to the historical record that says, given the past climate in this place, what is the upper 2% of temperature values that we see? Let's draw that as our threshold. The reason for that is that often the infrastructure in a place is adapted to its historical climate. So in areas that are traditionally warmer, there is often more air conditioning in both private dwellings and public buildings. That is, a broad brushstroke that doesn't necessarily speak to dimensions of equity, for example, who has access to that air conditioning, but as a way to think about extreme heat relevant to a place, that is what the scientific community tends to do. There is an extreme heat tool in CalAdapt that allows you to specify a threshold if you need to do something that is a little bit more customized. This is often just a first pass for many people. All right. So as we zoom down, we can see a chart. And in this chart, we have the historical observed extreme heat pattern. For example, I can see that in 1979, there were 11 days where the temperature was above this threshold of 90.2 degrees Fahrenheit in Manhattan Beach. Looking forward, I see two trend lines, and we'll get to those in a minute. But what I need to know is that we have this central tendency in the dark line, that's the average of all 32 models. And then this shaded area, which is the full range of the 32 models. Some of the models will produce a picture where extreme heat might look worse. Some of the models will project an extreme heat future that maybe is not quite as severe. It's good to use extreme values and central tendency together to describe, a scenario you might plan around, and then some of the sort of really extreme circumstances that might show up in any given year that you also need to be able to adapt to. I know that this is perhaps a lot of information coming at once, and Natalie did mention there'll be a Q&A opportunity, so feel free to throw stuff in chat, and we can get to it toward the end. All righty. The next thing I want to talk about is sort of fundamental climate science literacy here is emission scenarios. Emission scenarios mathematically capture possible future greenhouse gas conditions, contingent on human action. We have no idea what our greenhouse gas world is going to look like in 2060, let's say, because it depends on our emissions from now until then, and whether we achieve any degree of drawdown or mitigation or not. And so it's important in planning to consider what is the range of possible emissions futures, decide what makes sense for your risk tolerance, and then set forth with the data that comes from that process. The IPCC, the international body that produces a lot of climate science, has taken these emission scenarios and produced a few key ones that are illustrative of feasible futures. And they capture these ideas with the term representative concentration pathway, or RCP as the acronym. Whenever you see RCP, simply substitute in your head emission scenario. There are two that are often referenced in California planning, RCP 4.5 and RCP 8.5. 4.5 is a quote unquote medium emission scenario, where we anticipate that global carbon dioxide emissions peak by the year 2040 and then decline. That's sort of a middle of the road scenario, if you will. There's also RCP 8.5, which is a high emission scenario where we don't really manage any drawdown, and global carbon dioxide emissions continue to rise throughout the 21st century. The values themselves, like 4.5 and 8.5, refer to essentially solar radiation that comes from the concentration of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. But for your purposes, it may just be helpful to know that the higher the RCP number, the greater the concentration of greenhouse gases, and therefore the worse the climate change picture looks. These two scenarios, 4.5 and 8.5, have been endorsed by various California state agencies like the Office of Planning and Research for you to use in your work. There are other RCP scenarios out there, but for most purposes, you won't need to engage them. In your work, we would recommend that you consider how the RCP scenarios relate to your risk tolerance, and then to proceed from there, but to look at them separately. In contrast to the climate models, where averaging is a reasonable thing to do, with the RCP scenarios, with the emission scenarios, you don't want to average them. You want to look at them separately as two possible futures. If you're looking at particularly extreme events or quote unquote worse climate change, you may want to put more stock in the RCP 8.5 scenario. But regardless, it is often helpful to look at both. And the state of California recommends that you consider 8.5 through at least 2050 and really look at both beyond that. When in doubt, look at both, but definitely don't average them. They're each separate plausible futures. In the Local Climate Change Snapshot tool, those two different emission scenarios show up as two different colors in the figure. You can toggle them on and off here with these buttons, but you can certainly appreciate that the purple series, 8.5, shows an end of century climate picture that is worse than the teal 4.5 middle of the road emission scenario. That's intuitive and logical. You just see that illustrated here. It is of note that with the 8.5 scenario, we see a greater occurrence of extreme conditions, some of these upper end of century circumstances in which by the end of the century, we may see upwards of 40 or 50 extreme heat days per year. This data is also captured below the graph in a table. And we're going to talk about the time periods that end up in this table before I wrap it up and we have a conversation about any of your questions or observations here. So the last point I want to make that references time periods is this distinction between uncertainty and variability and how you might negotiate those two ideas in your work. This bears saying out loud, and perhaps is no surprise to any of you, that climate and weather are not the same thing. Climate is the long-term average of weather, where day to day the weather may vary, but we can say in the long term, some places are hotter, some places are cooler, some are wetter, some are drier. Those are climate observations. The weather on any given day, both in the past and looking forward, may typify what is considered normal climate in a spot, or it may not. We have some days that seem pretty odd given where we live. And that's a product in part of California's climate. This is a state where the climate, no matter where you are, can be pretty variable. Can be really cold, can be really hot, and year to year can see a ton of swing in precipitation, for example. We're looking down the barrel of a pretty significant drought, but I remember only a couple of years ago, we had at least in Northern California, a winter of some pretty wild atmospheric rivers. So California's climate variability that we are living under now will persist into the future. Climate change will not smooth out our year to year or month to month variability. In fact, it will probably exacerbate it. So that's just something to know. The variability we see in the past will also be variability in the future, though the average will change and is changing, and the extreme conditions are likely to actually get more extreme. Here's an illustration of Sacramento, where when we look at the annual average precipitation observed in Sacramento, that's this dark line in the middle, the dark gray zigzags. In 1 year, we saw 6 inches of precipitation. In the next year, we saw 30, or a few years later, we saw 37 inches of precipitation, with a typical range of about 10 inches to 30 inches. That's pretty wild and pretty hard to plan around. This sort of thing will persist. A lot of this variability is inherent to our climate system, and you'll see that show up in model projections. But there's this additional layer of uncertainty where we are projecting into the future, and we have uncertainty in our projections that come from both the sort of representation of climate systems, but also the fact that we don't know what people are going to do, and necessarily how all of our climate systems or Earth system processes are going to respond to, in the human timescale, novel climate conditions. So the figure you see here, even though it's happy and colorful, I think is a little bit frightening. It talks about how uncertainty may cascade through the ways that we represent the planet, human action, and ultimately climate. The first source of uncertainty is future society. For example, we don't know what our greenhouse gas trajectories are going to be because they depend on how we emit, the policies that govern emission and sequestration. A lot of that is very much TBD. So that sort of trickles into the second layer of uncertainty. We then have climate models that do a pretty dang good job of representing physical processes, but are not fully there. They're not entirely deterministic, where we don't have sort of mathematical certainty for how the planet works. These days, it's pretty hard to think about how cloud cover impacts climate. That's sort of at the edge of the sort of scientific modeling community's work right now. So we have some uncertainty that shows up in our climate models. And when we combine uncertainty in the climate models with uncertainty in greenhouse gas emissions, we have a magnification of the uncertainty. We then have difficulties thinking about regional circumstances. For example, microclimates in California, that's huge. You can, cross hills and the climate is, the temperature is 30 degrees different. That's something that is a little bit difficult for us to figure out right now. And then lastly, we have this issue about impacts, where we have an idea for how physical climate might change, but then what about adding insights into social services and physical climate change together? That's another layer of uncertainty. So I illustrate this just so that you have a sense for where things may get fuzzy on the margins. And none of this should be paralyzing. We know the direction that climate change is going. We have a pretty robust modeling program that gives us a sense of what is to come, and that accurately represents what has happened before. So we have a great degree of confidence. But just for the sense of sort of empowering you to know the information you're working with, this is a pretty important thing to keep in mind. CalAdapt and the information that we provide lives at the level of the regional scenario, where we provide climate change data drilled down to a regional lens. Everything below that, impact models, for example, how climate change is going to impact economic systems and employment patterns. And then what you might do to deal with that lays with you. To mitigate some of this uncertainty, we recommend that you aggregate data, because we want to look at sort of the average that may come out of a lot of this information, and not drill down on any individual year or place. So you should be aggregating in time and in space. As I mentioned, California's got this historically variable climate, and you would never capture the climate of California by selecting 1 year out of the historical record and saying, this is it, this is what it looks like in this state. We similarly don't want to do that looking forward. You don't want to look at the climate models and say, 2080, that 1 year, that's it. Instead, it's better to average information across decades. And typically, folks will say 30 years. You can compute a rolling 30-year average if you need that. But in general, folks will plan around a mid-century, that is 2035 to 2064. So it's centered on 2050. And then an end of century, that is, 2070 to 2099. So brushing up against the end of the century. That's one way to mitigate uncertainty. Another is to aggregate in space. So rather than drilling down to the parcel level, for example, or even a single grid cell that we talked about, you're going to want to look at cities writ large, or counties, not just buildings. So consider that as well in your work. In the Local Climate Change Snapshot tool, that shows up down here in this table, where you can see that we've presented time periods, pre-populated them for you, for the mid-century period and the end of century period. In other tools in CalAdapt, you can toggle these time ranges, but here, to keep things relatively straightforward, we've pre-computed those for you. We see the change from baseline, namely, when we look backwards, we have a sense of what is historical climate. When we look forward, how will things change? In this case, we can appreciate that for end of century conditions, under a high emissions scenario, we will see an average of an increase of 12 extreme heat days per year. So from our historical baseline of, 2 to 4 days, up to 12 days, or I'm sorry, up to 16 days. We have the 30-year average. So in this period of 2070 to 2099, on average, you'll see about 14 days. And then the 30-year range, some years it may be in the territory of 7 extreme heat days per year, others it may be 36 days, upwards of a month. The reason there is occasionally a discrepancy between our observed record And our change from baseline is that the baseline data that lives on CalAdapt is often modeled data. So we have a sense of what is observed, but this change from baseline is actually comparing to modeled historical data, because our observational record is a little bit patchy. Not all places have a monitoring history. Not all places have accurate monitoring instrumentation. So we will often use modeled data for comparisons to baseline. None of that should be too much of an issue. You are welcome to use either one, depending on which you feel fits into your work and will be sort of narratively understandable to your audience. Let's see. So my takeaways for responsible use of climate projections. One is take a look at individual models for the full range of potential conditions and model ensembles for some of that sort of average trajectory that you may plan around. The second is consider how RCP or emission scenarios relate to your risk tolerance. You know, if you're really concerned about extreme conditions, you may want to think about a higher emission scenario. Ultimately use both and use them separately. Do not average the emission scenarios. And then lastly, aggregate in time and space. Look at 30-year intervals, look at entire cities or entire counties, rather than individual parcels. So the last thought, the Local Climate Change Snapshot tool is one tool on CalAdapt, and we hope it's a place for many folks to begin. There are other tools that allow you to have sort of a greater degree of customization. You can look at temperature, sea level rise, snowpack change, heavy precipitation events, drought, and wildfire on CalAdapt. So these are all the values that are there. And this table itself comes from California's 4th climate change assessment that describes the direction of change as well as our scientific confidence in that direction. With that, I think I can take questions. Natalie, do you anticipate facilitating the question and answer period, or how would you like to go about this?
We have a little bit of extra time if you want to answer some questions now. I don't see any in the chat. Our moderator is Vanessa Reyes Salazar. So if anybody has, she's gonna read any questions that are in the chat later on during the Q&A. But if anybody wants to unmute themselves and ask a question aloud, right now to Lucy, we have about 8 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so we have one question in the chat that reads, how did you determine the scientific competence?
Sure. There are a few ways to answer this question. One is in that last table that I showed that talked about quote unquote scientific confidence, some of it being very high, that we're going to see increases in extreme heat, some of it being sort of moderately high, that we may see annual average precipitation values increase. A lot of that is consensus based from the scientific community, you know, where folks will essentially evaluate what are the concerns that we have about the way that we represent climate processes, and are those concerns that would impact our confidence, our ability to endorse this as a future. In a narrower sense, when we talk about confidence in climate models, scientists will determine that a climate model is useful with a suite of tests. So they will first run it as a hindcast and say, okay, the way that we've represented the Earth when we run the model backwards in time rebuilds the climate record with an acceptable degree of accuracy. Any individual year is unlikely to be accurate, but again, that's a weather question. The longer term trends are what we're looking at. What is the climate of a place? Scientists will also run these climate models for very certain test cases where they have a pre-specified essentially set of inputs that they will plug into the model and see, does it produce an output that we're expecting? That's a way to standardize climate models. They all at least pass these really basic tests. So I think those are sort of two ways of thinking about this question of competence. And if you're really curious for the details, a lot of that has been written in the publications that came out of the 4th climate change assessment. And when we're transitioning things, I can find some links and drop them in chat for those who, at least like me, have a bit of a wonky inclination.
Awesome. And so far, I don't see any other questions in the chat.
Then I'm going to get on my soapbox is the wrong word, but one more thought is that the data on CalAdapt you can access via these GUIs, these graphical user interfaces where you see charts and you see graphs. But you can also download the data. So if you want a raster of climate projections between now and the end of century for San Bernardino County, you can download that. You can do it either via the tools. There's a little button that says download this data, or you can go to CalAdapt's website and click on data. It's in the sort of top navigation bar and be guided through a download process where you can specify the location you're curious about, the particular physical climate change variables you want to see, the time periods, the step of the information. Do you want to see daily projections, knowing that ultimately you'll have to average them in some way? Do you want to see annual values? That sort of thing. So if you want to pull the information into your GIS environment or your coding environment, by all means, we encourage you to do that. I'm seeing Courtney. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So Courtney asks, are current conditions such as extreme heat, flooding, wildfires, etc., making you reconsider the models, recalibrating the models, etc.?
Yes and no. Many of these circumstances have been anticipated by climate models. The challenge that I think many scientists are reckoning with right now is the fact that a lot of these things are happening, quote unquote, sooner than expected. The degree of extreme event that we're seeing in many places, for example, I think about some of the Canada extreme heat and wildfires that ensued, or a lot of the flooding that is happening in the European Union and in China, are happening a decade earlier than we might have projected. That doesn't necessarily suggest that the models are wrong, but rather suggests that extreme event science and representation is really hard. It is often much easier to capture averages than extremes, because extremes are often really sensitive to what we'll call initial conditions or how you set things up. Whereas averages tend not to be in the mathematical representations of our climate systems. So I think that many folks are using what is going on right now to fine tune a lot of our climate models and sort of understand what is it we didn't capture. But I would say that none of what has happened has been outside the full range of what has been projected. It has just happened earlier and more frequently than we might have anticipated. So that's often why I'll encourage folks to really consider that 8.5 scenario, even if you're a climate optimist, where you do anticipate that we will collectively manage a degree of drawdown. Those extreme circumstances that may be better illustrated by the 8.5 emission scenario are definitely worth considering. And if these are questions that you're really excited to talk about, I have a colleague who is a climate modeler, a guy named Owen, who works on the CalAdapt team, and he would be super stoked to get into that with you. I often draft off of him. I'm not a climate modeler myself, but sort of unite the models to their application in a lot of my work.
Great. We have another question in the chat that says, for using the API, is there technical assistance available in a webinar or through the support at caladapt.org team?
Yeah, totally, 100%. I don't think we've put together a webinar, either recording or curriculum, that we could offer on demand for the API. We do have cookbooks, references to building API queries, for example. And if you're finding that those aren't working for your purposes, or you're running into mysterious error codes or like getting throttled somehow, by all means, shoot us an email to support@caladapt.org. Folks tend to get back to you in a day or two. And one of my colleagues in particular manages that infrastructure, Brian. So you'll probably hear from Brian. Yeah, I think that's what I would say. And if API stuff, is something that this group is interested, there's a critical mass of folks who are like, yeah, I actually would use an API to pull data. That's something that we can build some little webinar curriculum for you. We're pretty open to that kind of thing. That's our job.
Great, thank you, Lucy. So I don't see any other questions in the chat, but if any of the participants think of any questions for Lucy later on, go ahead and type them in the chat and she can answer them during our Q&A session, which will follow our next presentation. So thanks for the presentation and answering questions, Lucy. So our next presenter is Lorianne Estrez, an assistant regional planner within the SCAG Sustainability Department. Lorianne works on advancing SCAG's climate adaptation and resilience planning efforts, such as the SCAG Regional Climate Adaptation Framework, also known as CAF, and its collection of tools and resources. Today, Lorianne will be presenting on the CAF and showcasing some of the newly launched resources.
Great. Thank you, Natalie, for the introduction. Hi, everyone. And I'm Lorianne Estrez, planner within SCAG Sustainability. And today I'll be sharing some of the new resources and tools coming out of the Southern California Regional Climate Adaptation Framework. We know that several climate hazards have been and will continue to impact Southern California, such as extreme heat, sea level rise, inland flooding, drought, wildfire, and more. And so just looking at our impacts compared to the rest of the state really briefly, we can see that some of the largest historical increases in temperature have occurred in Southern California. And from this map, looking from 1895 to 2018. Additionally, in October 2020, FEMA identified SoCal as one of the most vulnerable areas in the US due to the multitude of natural hazards impacting the region. LA County, for instance, was found to be the most at risk nationwide, while Riverside County and San Bernardino County were among the 10 highest at risk counties in the nation, overall accounting for half of the counties in the SCAG region. And so recognizing the climate hazards we face in the SoCal region provided the impetus behind the SoCal Climate Adaptation Framework. Over a 2-year period, SCAG, in partnership with a team of consultants and through a Caltrans grant, developed the framework, which is a collection of tools and resources to help cities and counties prepare and adapt to climate change. Some of the tools include outreach and communication strategies and templates, general plan model policy language, climate vulnerability mapping, and adaptation financing resources. And so before jumping into development of these tools and continued throughout the project's development, SCAG conducted extensive stakeholder outreach to hear from local jurisdictions, communities, and elected officials. Overall, this outreach helped us better understand which climate hazards were already impacting communities, which were of most concern, and learning what tools could be most helpful to plan for climate change. SCAG also held focus groups and conducted interviews with local jurisdiction practitioners. We also met folks where they were through interviews with community-based organizations, setting up pop-up climate talk events across the region, and also held trainings and working group meetings throughout the project's development. And lastly, we also connected with elected officials through sub-regional presentations across the region and engaged with SCAG's regional council and policy committees. So as an overview, our outreach strategy helped identify some familiar key points and concerns felt across jurisdictions and communities, such as lack of dedicated staff resources for climate planning, a need for champions in this area of work, a need for furthering climate change education and helping show the linkages felt between locally felt climate change impacts to larger regional impacts. And then lastly, from SCAG's elected officials, we heard a growing need to include health and racial equity considerations into regional policymaking for climate change. Overall, this feedback helped inform development of the framework resources, again, all centered around the goal of helping build capacity for local jurisdictions. And so highlighting a couple of key resources from the framework, shown here is a snapshot of the SoCal Climate Adaptation Planning Guide, or shorthand SoCal APG. The SoCal APG describes the range of climate change hazards the SCAG region is facing and likely to face in the coming decades, and includes adaptation principles geared specifically to the SCAG Southern California region. The APG outlines a general process of adaptation planning that can be applied to any agency, no matter where they fall across the spectrums of funding, available resources, knowledge of vulnerabilities, and planning sophistication. Another resource I'd like to highlight, the CAF Communication Strategy Toolkit. This toolkit helps local governments better understand community members' climate-related challenges and effectively engage with stakeholders to plan for climate change. The Outreach Toolkit, developed in partnership with URLA, enables local planners and community-based organizations to create their own effective climate change and climate adaptation outreach strategies. It features templates for public workshops, including meeting materials, worksheets, noticing templates, and other tools that can help local planners engage and find ways to discuss adaptation and resilience in ways that resonate with their community members. And so pausing and looking at the mandates on local jurisdictions to address climate change, jurisdictions have the onus to update their safety elements to account for hazards and adaptive activities related to climate change per SB Senate Bill 379. Additionally, updates of safety elements should be coordinated with the update of housing elements per SB 1035. And lastly, with the update of two elements at the same time, jurisdictions may also need to address the requirements of SB 1000 to include environmental justice elements in their general plans. And so just several upcoming legislation requiring general plan updates in the near term. And so to help with these requirements, SCAG has developed a couple new resources I'd like to highlight today. One of them being the Housing Element Parcel or Helper tool, which can help jurisdictions understand the climate hazards and other environmental sensitivities of parcels in their communities for use in housing element site suitability work. Through Helper, users have several parcel attributes which they can turn on and off, such as existing land use, general plan designation, priority growth constraint areas, EJ opportunity areas, and more. Additionally, users can also identify and filter parcels that have climate hazards and other environmental sensitivities, including high and very high hazard fire risk zones, 100-year floodplains, landslides, wildlife, habitat and connectivity, and more. This data can help jurisdictions identify areas impacted by these hazards and plan for climate change and resilience accordingly, both in housing elements and safety elements. Now, also I'd like to note that these layers were developed with guidance from the Nature Conservancy, and importantly, the tool was built by Esri as part of the SCAG Regional Data Platform project. Secondly, another new resource to highlight, which stemmed from recognizing the limited amount of guidance on how cities and counties can go about achieving SB 379 compliance, is the SB 379 Compliance Curriculum for Local Jurisdictions, or Guidebook for shorthand. And so launched just last month, the Guidebook provides step-by-step guidance to help local jurisdictions on one, how to meet the requirements of SB 379, two, integrating resources from the Climate Adaptation Framework, as well as resources from state and partner agencies focused on adaptation planning. And lastly, reviewing case studies of SB 379 compliant safety elements, adaptation plans, and other methods of achieving SB 379 compliance. So a brief overview of SB 379. The legislation builds upon past bills addressing flood and fire protection in an effort to advance the state's overall climate adaptation goals. SB 379 requires all cities and counties in California to incorporate climate adaptation and resilience strategies into general plan safety elements by January 1st, 2022. So just a few months away. And so diving into the guidebook structure, the guidebook follows a phased approach mirroring the 4 phases of the SoCal APG. It provides a detailed step-by-step guidance to achieve SB 379 compliance and guides the user through development of the 3 main components required under the bill. 1, conducting a vulnerability assessment. 2, developing a set of resilience goals, policies, and objectives. And 3, developing a set of feasible implementation measures. And so shown here is a snapshot of the comprehensive graphic within the guidebook, showcasing the phases of the compliance curriculum, each step, and associated resources under each step, shown in gray along the left and right side of the screenshot. While this is a lot to take in at once in small text, I'd just like to highlight the series of steps, resources, and considerations a local jurisdiction may need to think about and work through throughout their safety element update process. And so breaking things down by section, each phase includes a narrative on the adaptation planning process and guidance on how to accomplish each step. Additionally, outreach and engagement considerations are highlighted at the beginning of each phase, shown at the bottom right of the snapshot from the guidebook. Next up, the guidebook also includes a table of key items to prepare and resources to help support each step. For instance, in this example, at the outset of step 2.1, identify climate hazard exposure, we recommend compiling a list of existing policies or plans that include climate adaptation goals, strategies, and policies to work through this step. Additionally, each step includes recommended resources to help support this step and are identified in the table as well. For instance, for step 2.1, we recommend compiling the jurisdiction's local general plan, local hazard mitigation plan, etc., pulling from specific resources from the climate adaptation framework, such as the vulnerability assessment, gap analysis of the SCAG region, and then also resources from the state, such as the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, Vulnerable Communities Guide. And so this is just one sample table of resources to compile, but this table follows along through each phase and step of the guidebook. Additionally, embedded within the guidebook are snapshots of resources from the climate adaptation framework to help supplement the narrative guidance on where to find and how to use existing resources for each step of the compliance process. A note that while the resources, or the full set of resources, can be accessed outside of the guidebook, brief summaries of each resource have been included to hold the storytelling voice of the curriculum and continuously guide the reader through the update process and in reading the guidebook. The guidebook also includes a section addressing the connection between climate change and environmental justice, reducing climate vulnerabilities, as intended by SB 379, can also help reduce community health risks and promote environmental justice, as intended by SB 1000. As a reminder, SB 1000 requires that with the update of 2 or more general plan elements, the environmental justice element of the general plan must also be updated. And so both bills involve addressing local community vulnerabilities and also require the development of general plan goals, policies, and objectives. And so this section of the guidebook, section 4, provides a brief overview again of the bill SB 1000 and links a few resources to help with EJ element updates, and then tying it all together and highlighting how climate change is also an environmental justice issue. And lastly, the final section of the guidebook includes a collection of case studies to help highlight SB 379 compliant vulnerability assessments, safety elements, and other approaches to meeting the safety element update requirement. Case studies include sample safety elements, local hazard mitigation plans, climate action and adaptation plans, vulnerability assessments, and sample environmental justice elements to provide samples of plans that can be used to either be summarized and fulfill the requirements of SB 379 or be updated and again meet those requirements. And so where to access the CAF resources and SB 379 guidebook. While this was a brief overview of the resources and guidebook, the full set of materials can be found at the link shown here. And lastly, if you're interested in learning more, SCAG is rolling out its General Plan Safety Element Technical Assistance Program in late summer 2021, estimated around mid to late August. And so the program is a partnership between SCAG Sustainability and the SCAG Local Information Services team, which is leading rollout of SCAG's regional data platform and has also been providing additional technical assistance for other general plan element updates, such as housing element updates. This program will feature one-on-one technical assistance with local jurisdictions interested in receiving support with their safety element updates, and will include a more in-depth review of the CAF resources, such as the SoCal APG, Outreach Toolkit, General Plan Model, Policy Language, as well as a more extensive look at the SB 379 guidebook and additional SCAG data map resources, such as the environmentally sensitive areas featured within the helper tool. And so if interested, please reach out to list@scag.ca.gov, as they'll be leading our outreach and engagement component for the program. So with that, thank you for having me. Any questions on the resources shown today can be directed to SCAG adaptation@scag.ca.gov. And again, for the technical assistance program, can be sent to list@scag.ca.gov. And so with that, I'll hand it back to Natalie for any questions for our Q&A section.
Great, thank you for the great presentation, Lorianne. Now we'll go into the Q&A portion of this training. If there are any questions in the chat, our moderator, Vanessa, will read them aloud now.
Thanks, Natalie. So far, there are no questions in the chat, but I'll give it a minute to let folks type any questions and I'll read them as they come in.
Great, thank you, Vanessa. So if you do have any questions for Lorianne, go ahead and type them in the chat, please, or you can also unmute yourself if you'd rather ask it aloud. And of course, if you have any additional questions for Lucy, you can do the same, type them in the chat or unmute yourself.
Still no questions in the chat as of now.
Okay. Well, given that there are no more questions, I guess we can end early. If anybody has additional questions that they think of later, please go ahead and email Lorianne and Lucy directly. They both included their email address in the chat. And just a reminder that a recording of this webinar and the PowerPoint slides will be available on the SCAG website. We will send a link to everyone who registered after the event. So thank you all so much for joining today's Toolbox Tuesday training. And thank you to our two presenters. So that concludes our training.